Let's open up our Bibles to Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8. We're going to continue our study in the book of Daniel. And this is another chapter that a lot of it is explained for us. It's in great detail, more detail than what is normal. And let me get my slide moving forward here. And there are some passages or phrases that are difficult to understand. We'll take our time, we'll look at that and describe those things and do our best. But in this chapter, we are now 2 years after chapter 7. When you look there at chapter 8, verse 1, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. So we're 2 years after that. We're written in first person, and it's written in Hebrew. So you may remember last chapter, it was in third person. And you may not know, because I wasn't pointing this out much, but in chapters 2 all the way to chapter 7, in the original that we have, it's written in Aramaic. In this chapter, we're now moving back over to the Hebrew writing, and it's in first person. Because of this, commentators, and I would consider him a scholar, Leopold, on this book, he puts the division here at chapter 8, leading chapter 7, with the other section. His reasoning is he believes that chapter 7 was meant for the Jews and the Gentiles at that time. Whereas here in this chapter, as we'll see, it's not meant for anyone yet. It's to be closed up and sealed, and it's meant for the Jews. And we'll see that as we see more specifics. This is concerning them. Those who ascribe to what we call the premillennialist idea that Jesus is going to come, reign on the earth for 1,000 years and have this millennial reign, they will misuse this chapter when we see the phrase the end times. But that, within its context, is talking about the end of the tribulation that the Jews will be going through from this little horn, as we'll take a look as we work through this section. So here's how we're going to break it down. We got the background, verses 1 and 2, the vision, 3 to 14, its interpretation, and Daniel's reaction. Very simple. It's not a difficult chapter. There's a couple of difficult passages, but there's a lot of historical significance in this chapter, and we'll take our time to look at a few of those things. So let's read verses, let's do 1 through 3. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam, and I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. So here he's got his vision, and he's about 200 inside the vision. He's about 200 miles away from Babylon and Susa, and there's this citadel there. He's inside of it. The canal is running through there, and he sees the ram. And it's already there. It didn't come running up. It's already there, and we're going to get to that here in just a second. Now, this palace that he's talking about is interesting. This is the same palace that when the Greeks, was it the Greeks? The Persians and the Medes, when the Persians and the Medes take over, because we're in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, so the Babylonians still have control. But when the Medes and Persians take over, their winter palace is going to be here. Artaxerxes, when he comes onto the scene, this will be his palace, and this is where Queen Esther is going to be. So there's a lot of significance here at this palace. And he's looking, and he sees the ram. He's already there, and it has 2 horns, and one grows longer than the other. What is that? The Medes and the Persians. In the beginning, before the Medes and Persians take over Babylon, the Medes had a greater influence and power within the group. But then Cyrus disposes of that king, and that's when he gets titled Cyrus the Great. And then the Persian influence upon the empire becomes greater, and it goes on to take over Babylon. So that's the significance between the 2 horns, and then one becomes longer than the other as the Persians really take control and begin to expand the empire. And so it's very strong. And it's standing there at this canal. Verse 4. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased and magnified himself. So you see him, he's powerful. Horns symbolically have a symbol of power. And he butts which ways? Lost my spot. Oh, yeah, here it is. Westward, northward, southward. Why not eastward? Okay, that's where they come from. It's not that they didn't take over nations and empires over there. They did, but the significance of this vision is all focusing in towards one particular point. So it's looking at them when they start coming this way and start taking the empires here. And as the vision progresses, it's getting more and more specific until it comes to one point that's important to the Jews. So this is just for historical reference. That's what these are here for. And so he's seeing these things. Also, the ram is a symbol that we find in Susa for the Medes and the Persians. You'll see pillars with a ram's head, some staves as well, and that way we found many things in antiquity. So we know that being a symbol of them. So verse 5, while I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So who might this be? Greece, yes. This is the Grecian people, the Mesopotamians, and they're running, and it's running so fast it doesn't even touch the ground. And it comes up beside the ram here at the canal. Some commentators make a significance about that water, that canal there, because when Greece had one of its great battles with the Persians, there was the Ganges River, or one of the rivers that was separating them. It was in its flood stage. So it was impossible to pass, and the Persians didn't worry about it. They didn't prepare for them, thinking, oh, they'll have to wait till the flood season is over before they can cross over. But Alexander the Great did cross it and caught them unawares and just wiped them out. He took out the Medes and Persians pretty quickly within a couple of years, and then just moved on to other things. And so they came, and as the text says, it had a mighty wrath, or some texts say anger, toward the Medes and the Persians. And that probably comes from about 150 years ago. They really suppressed Greece and just treated them horribly, as well as the other kings of the Medes and Persians going in, trying to take the land, plundering them, killing them off and on throughout the years. And now they're rising up. Now, who was king before Alexander the Great? Do you remember? That's right, it was his father. Okay, yeah, Philip. And he was a great tactician, very smart man. He is the one that found all the gold in what biblical city? Philippi. He found that mine of gold, and he was getting so much out there, he was using it to bribe all these cities as he goes in. He didn't have to fight many battles. He was just paying his way into these cities and taking over. And he was having his son trained up and learned under whom? Aristotle. Aristotle trained Alexander the Great. And then when Philip died, Alexander the Great became king at what age? Young age. 20 years old. And within 2 years, he mounted up a military campaign and went after the Medes and Persians. And he took over most of the known world, all out to India, by age 32. Hence, moving over the face of the earth without touching it. He was exceedingly great very good at what he was doing. He knew exactly how to take care of things. And his military force was inferior to all others. He was a very small force, but they were very well trained. And I think that's where Rome learned that from him, watching what was going on there with him. So the focus of Daniel's vision was on, like I was saying, the people of God. So things are going to be moving further down as we come around here. So he's moving on, verse 8, and then it breaks. That horn on the breaks. That happens as he's on his way back from India when his soldiers were tired of fighting and they wanted it to be done. He got sick. He gets to Babylon, and he dies there. I had the year somewhere. Did I write it down? Oh, I don't see it in here. Maybe I didn't write it down. Well, I can't remember which year he died in, but we have it. And he died in the city of Babylon. And from that, 4 conspicuous horns grow toward the 4 winds of heaven. Those are the 4 generals. And the 4 winds of heaven, the full domain of Alexander the Great goes to these 4. And of the 4, only 2 really had any great power. One of them was the Seleucid Empire or dynasty. They're the ones that are in the southern part of Egypt and other places. And we're going to read about that one next as it narrows down. We're in Daniel chapter 8. Verse 9. Out of one of the 4 horns that grow up out of the ram's or the goat's head, out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. All right, so south, the east, so you got the toward Syria, toward Egypt, and what's the beautiful land? Yeah, Palestine. It's Canaan, God's people. Verse 10. Well, no. Yeah, because that's east would be Syria. Okay. Right, but it's not designating where it's at. It's just toward the beautiful land. It's specifying where we're going, I think, in the vision. And so he mentions just where he goes, but he also focuses right there. And how many nations put this kind of focus on Palestine, on the Canaan area? None do until he does. And he doesn't, I'm not just saying he's going to go there and Jesus is going to take it. He puts a lot of focus on this area, as we'll see as we work through it. And in history, who do we think this might be? Antiochus IV, as he calls himself, Epiphanes. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means and who he is. And he does rise up from that one of those horns later on. Verse 10. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. Okay. So let's talk about the let me get here. This, should I talk about it now or wait? No, let's do it now. The stars that fell to the earth, and the host and some of the stars fell to the earth. What could those be? The Jews. That's what I think. Some say they're angels. Premillennialists will go in that direction. But this, usually when we think of the host of heaven, we think of the angels. But there are places in the Bible where host is used as God's people or his children. And the host here we know is directed toward the beautiful land. And we know through history it is those whom he is going to trample down and cause to have a great hindrance to them. And quite a bit, as we'll get into here in just a moment. And so the interpreter, when we get further on in the text, the interpreter for Daniel tells them that when the transgressors have run their course, and previously God had told the people, the Jews, that he would give them up for plunder and spoil because they would not hold to his ways. And at that time, way back when, not this time, but before the captivity, Why did God send them into captivity? Why was he warning them about going into captivity? What was their main problem? Okay, year of Jubilee. What else? Idolatry and a whole host of sins. And if they weren't going to make things right, off the captivity they would go. And so, of course, captivity extinguishes idolatry, right, and gets rid of that. However, their abuse of the sacrificial order, their abuse of the priesthood comes to a head, and even Malachi begins to preach against that. Do you remember what Malachi said to the Jews of concerning this, what God had him say? What did God think of their sacrifice? Useless. Stop it. And did they? They did not. And so God is going to take the sacrifice away for a time. And that's going to happen under this king, Antiochus. He is the one that's going to bring it, but he's going to, as many do, take it too far. Remember when Habakkuk was asking God, what are you going to do about Israel and about Judah? They're so sinful. What are you going to do about those people? And what did God tell him? I'm going to raise up the Assyrians. And then he's going to come. He's going to take the northern kingdom away. And how did Habakkuk respond to that? Ooh, not the Assyrians. They're so bad. They're so evil. He says, God told him, yes, I know. They will accomplish my purpose, but they will fill their cup, and they will be judged. And Antiochus is going to fulfill God's purpose, but he's going to overfill his cup, and God will judge him as well. And we'll see that summarized here as well. And so he exalts himself. He brings the stars, the host and some of the stars to fall to earth, and he'll trample them down. We believe those to be the Jews. Verse 11, it even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And we're going to dive deeper into all of those things here in just a moment. Get myself caught up. I'm moving too fast, I think. Oh, here it was. Alexander the Great died Babylon in 323 at the age of 32. So I knew I had it written down. So, verse 13. Let me get there. All right. So, as already mentioned, no, we're not in 13. I meant 11. I apologize. Get myself organized here, guys. I'm sorry. So, the commander of the host, reference to God, and this interpretation is confirmed by the use of the pronoun. You got the him and his in regard to the temple. So this little horn, Antiochus, presumptuous in thinking that he could be what? Equal with God. I was going to put up some pictures. I did not look them up. But there's a lot of coinage we have from his era where he had some coins made and of course, his image on it. And in the background, he would have stars draping over his head, or the sunlight coming out, rays out from behind his head, which would be a sign of what? Divinity. He put himself as equal with God. He saw him as God, and he made himself equal with God. And so he magnified, verse 11, itself to be equal with the commander of the host. That's God. And so he had these coins put out, and showing his arrogance, and he referred to himself as Epiphanes. We probably have heard that term, and that means illustrious, the illustrious one. That's how he saw himself. And at the time, people had a nickname for him, which was, I think it's Epimanes or Epimans, and that meant madman. They thought he was a mad man. And so the text goes on here in the Bible telling us that he removed the regular sacrifice from him, God, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. Now, this is he's talking about the continual sacrifice, the daily sacrifice, the morning and the evening sacrifices that they would give. It consisted of what? 2 lambs, one offered in the morning, the other one's offered in the evening. You also had the grain offering, that flour mixed with oil. The libation of wine was poured out. And all these things represented the basic maintenance of the sanctuary. And it was the foundation for the Jews of preserving God there at the temple. Well, no, we're not in, this won't be at captivity. Oh.
There's no sacrifices right now.
Right.
Because there's no
Correct. But they're going to get back, they'll have it all built up, and God's going to take it away again. So, some people always wonder, and I think the question came up last week, why would Daniel be so pale in face and sickened by this, and he's going to be distressed by this as well. Imagine you've been going through captivity, no sacrifice, you don't have the temple, then they'll learn that you will get it all back only for it to all be taken away again. How distressing. And now Daniel doesn't have any children, but I think he saw all the Jews as his children. He's been helping them along, he's been encouraging them, he's seen it as a leader as well as Ezekiel and others, and he wants what's best for them. And to know that they're going to turn their backs on God to such a point again that this is going to have to happen, it's sickening. It'd be like someone coming to tell you what's going to happen with your children in the future if they fall away, if they make bad choices. And you're going to learn, here's what your kids are going to do, and some good, some bad. And it worries you. It brings a lot of stress. And I think that's what's happening to Daniel, and I think that's what's going to happen to him here as well. That's stressful to see that it's just they're not going to really learn, and they're going to have these issues yet again. And so we read here about the removal of this regular sacrifice of the Jews. That's the component of Antiochus, his attempt to Hellenize the Jews, to unite them into one kingdom. And this is a historical fulfillment of Daniel's vision. I think it's, the Maccabees, 1st Maccabees, chapter 1. Now, Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees is in the Apocrypha. That is not biblical, but I think 1st Maccabees is a good historical book. It was written at that time by those who had the Maccabean revolt. There's a lot of good things in there as far as history is concerned. And here's what it says concerning this situation. It says, then the king, that's Antiochus, wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defy the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacrifice precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. And secular history proves that out. That's exactly what he did, not just in Judah, but in all the places he was at, in Egypt and in other areas. His goal was to bring people away from their cultures and their customs and under his, and he be their God. And so when he took away the regular sacrifice from the temple, he was guilty of taking it away from God himself. So his abominable acts were a indirect opposition to God, who had given the law to his people. And at the height of this sacrilege occurred in December of 168 BC, when a pagan altar was erected on top of the altar of burnt offerings, and they made offerings to Zeus there on the altar. So it was bad, very bad. So it seems that Antiochus is most certainly this little horn we're reading about in Daniel 8. Can we know for absolute certain? I would say no. But everything really seems to point to this guy. He comes up after the four generals rise up. He comes up after them, and he falls in line with a lot of these things we're reading about here in Daniel chapter 8. And when we get down to Gabriel's explanation, he brings that out, that this is God's will. He brought this about, and this is the part of the whole plan. I mean, he knew it was going to come. He planned for it to come. And just like he planned for the Assyrians to take care of Israel, but they'll take it too far, he'll judge them. He planned for this guy, he'll take it too far, God will judge him. Yes, I don't think they understood that. He was taking it away from the Jews because they were profaning it already. They were making sacrifices, but they had the wrong heart, the wrong motive. I require obedience and not sacrifice, is what the text tells us over in Malachi. And so he needed to take away from them so they understand you're doing this out of faithful obedience, not out of, just rote structure of this is something I have to do, which is what their mindset had become, and they weren't really faithful to God. Does that make sense? And so I think that's what's happening in Malachi, and that's why God's letting Daniel know about this here. At the end of this chapter, he's going to tell him to seal it up. And there's a lot of speculation. How long was it sealed up before the Jews knew about this vision of what this foretelling? Because Gabriel is going to tell him, oh, this one's the Medes and Persians, and this one's the Greeks. And so they'll know exactly who's coming, but when did they know? Some speculate that this wasn't open until after the Maccabean revolt, and they could see that Daniel knew about it all the time. I have no idea when they learned of it, but it will be tied up, and I don't know when the Jews actually got to see this vision. So I don't know. I wish we knew. But then again, some things are kept from us, as we'll see here in a little bit when we look at some other things in the text that's difficult. But God, through providence, I think, makes things known to us. For centuries, people thought the Hittite nation, empire, never existed, even though the Bible mentioned it all over the place. And then archaeological evidence came to light that proved that, yes, there was a Hittite empire. The Bible was right. And many things have occurred where every once in a while, little gold nuggets will be dropped to us to show us, yes, the Bible is correct. Maybe there's some coming down the line in the future that God will show that help us better understand some of these things, the 2,300 mornings and evenings, for example. I think that's a difficult one. We'll look at that one here in just a moment. In fact, we better move on. And so, verse 12. And on account of transgressions, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? He said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. So Antiochus is going to throw down truth, which he does. He's going to try to pull people away from the law, follow after him. And Daniel hears these two holy ones speaking. I think the New Revised Standard has, in verse 14, instead of saying he said to me, it says he said to him. However it's supposed to be translated, it's meant for Daniel's ears. It's not that these angels didn't have an understanding, I think. I think it's for his sake that he hears this and focuses even more where this vision is going. So we've gone from the goat and the ram, the four horns, to the one horn, and down to some specifics about that, and these things are being brought to light. So how long will this go about where they will no longer be able to give sacrifice? That's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. They want this for the people of God. They want this for the Lord. They remember the angels long to look into the things of the Messiah. They know what's supposed to come, and I don't think they had the full insight of all the way at this point. And so they're throwing this out there, I think, for Daniel's sake about this timeline. And the one said to Daniel, verse 14, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. This is the most difficult part of this chapter. What does the 2,300 evenings and mornings mean? The most popular view is that the phrase means 1,150 days. And if you're wondering how do they come to that, well, remember there's two sacrifices, one in the morning, one in the evening. And they're viewing a day as being those two sacrifices. So you would cut it in half, 2,300, and you'd get 1,150 days. I can understand that. So they also see that this view mentions the 3 years, or which is what, 3 years and a few months? Yeah, 3 years and a few months. And so they say that this is the 3 years that transpired from when the time the temple was desecrated by Epiphanes, that was December 168, to the time it was rededicated by the Maccabean revolt by Judas in December 165, which is exactly 3 years. 1,150 days is just over 3 years by a couple of months. So it's possible that the evening and morning sacrifices were ended prior to Antiochus' desecration of the temple, accounting a few extra months. So it's not perfect, but I could see that. Another popular view is to see the 2,300 evenings and mornings referring as full days, equaling 6 years and 4 months. This view appeals to the use of the phrase evening and morning as a one day from Genesis chapter 1 and other places. So in this case, they would reach back to the beginning of Antiochus' abominable treatment of the Jews in 171 BC to the time of the rededication in 165 BC. Again, it's not perfect, but I can see where that makes sense. Now, based on the context of what we're reading, most likely the 2300 does not indicate a specific number of years, I think. This is just an opinion. People sometimes identify symbols as being specific. They try to find those in the 2300. I think whatever that might be, whether it's the 6 years or 3 years, it is a time of when they lose the sacrifice. And who is this vision for? As we come to the end of it, it's clear it's for the Jews. I bet you at the time when this all came about during the Maccabean revolt, they probably understood exactly what the 2300 was. We're not exactly sure. The most appealing to me would be the morning and evening sacrifice for the 3 years and a few months in between when they lost, possibly that time when the sacrifice was lost. I don't know. But I do know it has to do with the time they lost the sacrifice. That time occurred under Antiochus, and it was regained at the time of the Maccabean revolt. How much time spanned in that? 2,300 mornings and evenings of the sacrifice, whatever that might be. But it came back, and it was for them. And it has nothing to do with the coming of Christ or the end of time when Christ comes again. That's the context of the chapter. It is meant for the Jews. So that's my thought. Anybody want to have a better thought or better explanation on that for me? Those are the two most popular views, and mine is simply, we're not sure. And it's hard to know. We can't specify exactly. But we can know it has something to do with the loss of sacrifice at the temple. Yeah, it doesn't matter because it's been fulfilled. What does matter is that this was given here. We know it happened way before these events, and Daniel knew exactly who was going to come and what nations were going to rise up. That's pretty amazing. It shows us God's ability to see into the future. And so the verse ends with, then the holy place will be properly restored at that point. The holy place must refer to the temple. It was rededicated by Judas Maccabeus. Judas the Hammer, if you didn't know, was his nickname. And his army in December of 165. They cleared the temple area of all the pagan altars. They tore down all the things that weren't supposed to be there. They rebuilt everything and rededicated it in December of that year, 3 years later. So the annual celebration, so they had a celebration, which was in December. It lasted for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of whatever that month it was. I should have looked that one up, but it's December for us. The annual celebration is also talked about or referred to in John chapter 10, verse 22 as being the Feast of Dedication. It's also known as the Feast of Lights, and it's also known as what today? Hanukkah. That's Hanukkah. It's when they remember the Maccabean revolt and the rededication of the temple, in case you ever wanted to know. That was it. Now, the more you know. Now let's move on to the next part, verses 15 and following. All right, let's read 15 to 19. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of the Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So he came near to where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Now while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand upright. He said, behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. Oh man, end of time. People read that and immediately their thoughts go to the end of the earth time. Contextually, the end of what time? What was he just looking at? Sacrifice. The loss of the sacrifice and the taking away of the sacrifice there in the temple. That's what he's going to talk about, and that's what he's going to get into here in just a moment. It has nothing to do with the second coming of Christ or the end of times, as the premillennialists will say. I do want to talk a little bit about Daniel sank into a deep sleep and his face to the ground. Interesting. Some commentators think he fainted, and their reasoning is that the stress of everything he's seeing and taking in was overwhelmed him, and he fainted or passed out. Maybe. I don't know. He's pretty old. He's up there in age at this point, 70s, and so it's going to be a stressful thing for him to see. I think he understood quite a bit of this, maybe not everything specifically, and he's always going to have more questions that we'll see here in a little bit, but it's stressful upon him. And so then Gabriel brings him back up and then repeats himself to him. Listen up. I've got something I want to tell you about the end of these things, the appointed time. So the time was appointed by God. He's the sovereign over the affairs of men. Jim was talking about that a moment ago. He's in charge. That's what he's talking about. The second, the end, anticipated the conclusion of what the vision was talking about and not the end of the time. So the time of the end, I think, is directly related to the question of how long God would allow his people to be persecuted by Antiochus. I think that's all that's going on here in this passage. Could be wrong, but it seems to fit. And so he falls asleep at this. He wakes him back up, lets him know, listen up, here's what I want to discuss with you. So he goes into this starting in verse 20. The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. In the latter period of their rule, the four kings, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. So there in verse 23, when the transgressors have run their course, I think that's the Jews. I think that's their inability to do sacrifice the way God has been imploring them to do, having the right heart and the right mind. He's had enough. And so he's going to let Antiochus to come in and remove the sacrifice. I think that's what's happening there in verse 23. So he's Antiochus is described as insolent. The Hebrew phrase there can be literally translated as stern-faced. I think the NIV has that. But it is an idiom. It's the point of his attitude and it's his demeanor. Instead of referring to Antiochus' appearance, they point to his attitude. They point to the way he was. He was bold and he was cruel. He was stubborn and vicious and dangerous. He was skilled in intrigue, or as the King James puts it, understanding dark sentences in the way he talked. He would probably say things where it would come across flattery, where you expect one thing and you would receive a whole nother thing on this. That happened to the Jews a lot. He sent an emissary down into Judea, to collect tribute. And as he was going, he was publicly praising the Jews as he was going from small town to small town, taking his time as these people would go up to Jerusalem to let them know, oh, they're singing your all's praises, and they understand your frustration. They want to sit down with all the leaders and the chief priests to go over these things, to see what we can do to try to bring these people together. And so when he finally came to Jerusalem, this emissary, they all gathered together thinking, oh, well, let's work this out. Here's our grievances. So then he brought in his army, killed them all, and ransacked the city killing probably about half the Jews there. They tricked them in order to wipe them out, to force them under his rule, and to praise him, give him the worship. He was an evil, evil man. Verse 24 tells us he's going to be mighty in power. He was successful in carrying out his agenda. His power would be granted by God there in verse 24. Oh, we haven't read that. So his power will be mighty, but not by his own power, because it's given from God. Not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease, which we already talked about. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. The vision of the evening and mornings which has been told is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. So he will be successful. He will even oppose the prince of princes. Who might that be? Well, it could be God. It could also be the angels. There's an argument for both. I tend to think it's God, because that's where he tries to put himself on the level of God, and he takes it too far. But he will eventually be broken without human agency. Epiphanes and Antiochus. How he dies is this. He starts to lose battles. I think he's in Babylon, or maybe it's Susa, or one of the Persian cities. And he's getting word that he's losing all these battles. And he gets word about the Maccabean revolt. And even Judah, he's losing that. He gets so despondent and depressed, he becomes bedridden. And while he's getting all these reports and being depressed, he just eventually gets sick and he dies. And that's the end of him. And that was it. No one killed him. He just withered away, literally, until he died, and fulfilling this part of the vision. And then verse 27, then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it. Carried out the king's business. Who's the king at this time? Belshazzar. So he wasn't completely absent. He wasn't completely out of everything. He was working for the king, just not at the level he was under Nebuchadnezzar. If you remember when Belshazzar saw the handwriting on the wall, he didn't even think about Daniel until the queen mother came in and told him about it. But Daniel was still working for the king. But how stressful it must have been for him to have all this stuff revealed to him, knowing that we're about ready to come out of the 70 years, only for it all for this to happen as well. What heartache, what this difficulty. Like, it's as if God would come to us and give us a vision about what's going to happen to America. You're going to come out of the issues that whatever you're facing, a difficulty might be, but in the future, I'm going to put you right back in it, because the people won't learn. How much heartache is that? We don't want that for our country, do we? Daniel doesn't want that for his people. God doesn't want that for his people. The angels didn't want that for them. How long will this go? 2,300 evenings and mornings. That's how long. However long that might be. Maybe it's however long it takes. I don't know. But they needed it. And it, again, whipped them back into shape. And we don't see too many issues arise until the Pharisees start taking things too far, and they get right back in the boat where they were before. Because were they ready when John the Baptizer came? No, especially not when Jesus showed up. They were not ready. But they did all they could. God did all he could to get them ready for the Messiah. And so few accepted the message. Any comments or questions on chapter 8? Yeah, so what they ended up happening was, like the text says, they were not teaching, and as a result, false teachings was able to easily come in, and they drifted away, and of course, ultimately taken into captivity. And the same thing's going to happen again here later on with Antiochus. Last thing, and then we got to close it up. Right, well, the ease, you're right, that was a time of ease, but the ease that he's talking about there was Antiochus brought them at ease, made them feel like everything's going to work out just fine, only to stab them in the back and kill their leaders, and then, again, push his agenda. And ultimately, he's going to bring in his own sacrifice into the temple and desecrate it in such a horrific way for them. And terrible things. And poor Daniel being shown these visions has just made it of course, stressful for him, and I can fully understand that. Well, next week we're going to get into chapter 9, and we'll spend either 1 or 2 classes on that. That one's far more difficult. Thank you for your comments and your questions. Good morning. Open your Bibles, if you would, to Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. I want to tell you a story about a certain Boy Scout master. He was very determined to get his scouts to be very ready for the Court of Honor. It's a very prestigious moment for them. And so he ordered that each one of them be ready to report to him about a good deed they had done the day prior. So the next day came, and the Boy Scout master came up to the first young man and asked him, okay, what did you do? He said, well, I helped a little old lady cross the street. He said, very good. He goes to the next Boy Scout. He said, what did you do? He said, well, I helped him with the little old lady cross the street. He said, okay. And he goes to the third boy, and he said, all right, what did you do? And he replied, well, I helped those two help the little old lady across the street. Frowning, the scoutmaster asked the fourth boy, what was his good deed? And he replied, well, I helped those 3 help the little old lady cross the street. And he said, well, now look here. Why did it take 4 boys, all 4 of you, to help this little old lady cross the street? And the fourth one replied, saying, well, that's because she didn't want to cross the street. Are you someone who easily accepts the help of others? Some of us are willing to help others. We want to, but are we willing to, or I should say, are we unwilling to receive help? In some respects, here in America, we were built with an independent spirit, and that permeates all of us. I know I have it. Even little Julie shaking her head, yes. Independent spirit, that is so true. Now, some of us, we've had it drilled into us that we should pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? And never depend on anyone for anything. And if this kind of attitude is taken to the extreme, it can have a devastating impact on individuals, can have a devastating impact on society. The truth is that kind of philosophy is not taught, nor is it supported in the Bible. In reality, every single one of us we not only need the Lord, but we need one another. God created us for dependence. Not to say that we don't have free will. He wants us to have that. Not to say he doesn't want us to have the independent nation that we have here. He wants us to have these freedoms, but we need to realize just how dependent we really are. Sometimes folks will justify their independence by saying, well, you know, the Bible says God helps those who help themselves. You heard that? Not in the Bible. It's not there. In fact, the Bible teaches the opposite truth. God waits to assist those who finally come to the point in their lives where they cannot help themselves, and they willingly surrender themselves to a loving God. And in class this morning, they were talking about, brought up Ezekiel chapter 34, but I was thinking 32, the valley of the dry bones, where Ezekiel sees all these dry bones, and God says, this is the Jewish nation. And they finally come to a point where they've said, we have no hope. It's all dried up. And that's where God wanted them. So they would come to a realization they needed him. When I think about Saul of Tarsus, I picture him as someone who was pretty self-sufficient. When we've been looking at his life prior to his becoming a Christian, don't you get the idea that that was a very self-sufficient individual, very independent spirit, someone who did not need anyone at all? Well, consider the fact that Saul wasn't married. He would never get married. And so he faced when faced with the risen Christ and became a Christian, one of the things he likely needed to learn was a humble dependence. He needed to learn that, I think. He was left in solitude of Arabia and returned to Damascus. And the Lord had already begun working on that, I believe, perhaps a stubborn will, that independent spirit. But unlike his sudden conversion, such as that transformation, that kind of transformation, he wasn't going to receive that instantaneously on his spirit, the level of his heart. I think Saul learned humble dependence through a series of circumstances. And I think we'll see that these circumstances were forced on him to force him to be humbly dependent upon God. So let's start with the story here in Acts 9. Let's look at verses 20 to 25 first, if you would. Starting in verse 20. And immediately he, that's Paul, began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, "He is the Son of God." All those hearing him continued to be amazed and were saying, "Is this not he who in Jerusalem destroyed those who called on this name, and who had come here for the purpose of bringing them bound before the chief priest?" But Paul kept increasing in strength and confounding the Jews who lived at Damascus by proving that this Jesus is the Christ. When many days had elapsed, the Jews plotted together to do away with him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were also watching the gates day and night so that they might put him to death. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a large basket. So the narrative here in Acts 9 makes it look like there's this seamless transition, I should say, between verse 19 and 20. But you may remember last week when we were looking at the book of Galatians, it was not seamless. 3 years went by. Paul says that after his conversion, he went immediately to Arabia. And then later he returned to Damascus. And it wasn't until 3 years later he went up to Jerusalem. But Luke's narrative, it just kind of goes right through there. Well, here in verse 20 and following, Saul has returned to Damascus, his place of conversion. And he is amazing people with his preaching about Jesus in the synagogues. Obvious reasons, people are astonished by him because his jump from being persecutor to preacher. So once the switch in Saul's mind was flipped, it was easy for him to employ that intellect, employ that knowledge and the training as a rabbi, convincing people, proving that Jesus is the Christ. And as you would expect, his growing popularity, his effectiveness was viewed as a threat by all the Jewish leadership. Something had to be done. They needed to silence Paul. They couldn't allow this to go on. Now, it may be difficult for us to understand or maybe to, the fact that we would be silenced in such a way, to have a contract put out on our lives. But that's what Saul was experiencing. Here he is. He's out there after the flip was switched. I am really fumbling the words this morning, right? Slow down. That's what I need to do. The switch was flipped, right? And he knew he needed to get out there and preach the truth. He needed to get out there and start showing people what he learned and really came to a realization on the road to Damascus. And he got out there and he started to do it, and the Jews couldn't allow that to happen, could they? They had to make him stop. They had to kill him, get him out of the way. How scary would that be? Could you imagine if someone in our government decided, you know what, we don't like what you guys are saying at North Valley. Everyone at North Valley, we have your name, we know where you live, and we're putting a contract on your life. We want you dead. When we find you, we're going to kill you. That's scary. But that's what Paul was experiencing in this new life in Christ. The mighty hunter, now the hunted. His enemies wanted him so badly, they posted guards at all the gates, exiting and leaving there from the city of Damascus. Could you imagine the fear that he had to have? The sense of helplessness. But notice how God worked on Saul's behalf when he finds himself in a place of humble dependence. Verse 25, but his disciples took him by night, let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. These unidentified disciples. We don't know them by name. Saul did. And what about the way these new followers assisted him? They lowered him in a basket down the wall. Could you imagine Saul of Tarsus agreeing to that? He did. He had to. His need forced this once independent Saul into depending on this nameless group of faithful disciples to rescue him from certain death by means of a basket hanging from a rope in the middle of the night down the wall. Having to leave Damascus in the dead of night, where would he go? Well, the next verse lets us know in verse 9, when he came to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of all the places, the headquarters of the Jewish opposition, that's where he goes. But do you think that it must have been different for Paul, for Saul? I mean, he's entering that city with a whole new perspective of looking at life. No longer was this going to be the place of refuge for him. This place, most of the people there probably wanted him dead. This was his alma mater, you could say, right? He knew Jerusalem like the back of his hand. Everyone that was of significance in the city, he knew who they were. And how do you think they received him? Well, they wanted him dead. There wasn't any red carpet rolled out for Paul that day. So verse 26 tells us, when he came to Jerusalem, he was trying to associate with the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. So the Christians in Jerusalem, they didn't want anything to do with him. And no one could blame them for that. This is Saul of Tarsus. He's been killing them and arresting their family members and throwing them in jail. They thought he was a spy, that he was there to trap them. That would have been a brilliant plan too, right? You know, pretend you're a Christian, get into their ranks, find out where they are so we can round them all up. They were too afraid of him. Have you ever felt that kind of sting of rejection? Where the two sides that encompasses pretty much everyone, neither one of them wanted you. He's there in that city, wandering around, trying to, I don't know what, figure out what to do. It's a hard place to be. And we're not told how long this occurred in this no man's land. God was teaching him, I think, humble dependence. And the Bible tells us in verse 27, but Barnabas took hold of him and brought him to the apostles and described to them how he had seen the Lord on the road and that he had talked to him and how at Damascus he had spoken out boldly in the name of Jesus and he was with them, moving about freely in Jerusalem, speaking out boldly in the name of the Lord. Even in Jerusalem, he was preaching the word. But I like how this starts. But Barnabas, good old Barnabas, son of encouragement. How did he overcome the fears that other Christians had? We don't know. But he took hold of Paul and brought him to the apostles. He went on a limb for Paul. And he does that, doesn't he? He always finds those who are in trouble or in a difficult spot or in need, and he goes out there and he helps them out. You got to love Barnabas. Willing to take Saul into his fellowship, and he encouraged others to do the same. So Saul moved into Barnabas' guest room, I guess, got to work there in Jerusalem, spreading the good news. And as you can probably predict, because you probably read the story, that ministry of his prompted further opposition. Verse 29. And he was talking and arguing with the Hellenistic Jews, but they were attempting to put him to death. There it is again. But when the brethren learned of it, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him away to Tarsus. So there again, Saul finds himself in need of help, of survival. And again, he's assisted by this newfound and nameless advocates. They just described as brothers. They take him down there to Caesarea up north. And from there, they buy him a ticket on a boat and send him off home to the place of Tarsus. And why send him there? Well, Meyer says in his commentary, so the disciples brought the hunted preacher down to Caesarea, sent him forth to Tarsus. Not improbably, he resumed tent making there, content to await the Lord's will and bidding. Years passed slowly. Possibly 4 or 5 years were spent in comparative obscurity and neglect. Now, no doubt, I think he was probably teaching and preaching. But everything we know about Saul of Tarsus and about who he's going to become as Paul, is this something that he would want to do, to sit by idly and do nothing, just stay in one little town? Could he do that? He had to. You think that's what he wanted to do? No way. No way. He wouldn't want to do that. He would want to get out there, preach, teach, show everyone the truth that he had learned. No. No, it's not time for that yet. You wait. You know who that makes me think of? Moses. Remember when Moses came out and thought he was the one to lead the Hebrew people out of Egypt, and so he encouraged his brothers not to fight. He killed an Egyptian for striking a Hebrew, and they said, "What are you going to do, kill me too?" And that scared him, and he ran off. Went off there into Moab and found a wife and stayed in obscurity. He thought that was his time. He was trying to do it his own way, on his own timetable, and God said, "No, not yet. Not yet." And I think that's the situation here with Saul. Not yet, Saul. Well, I'll go to Jerusalem. Nope. Go north. Go home. Wait there. Wait. But I was waiting in Arabia for 3 years already. A little longer. That had to be difficult for him. But so he did. The man who's probably used to being in charge and being in control, and now off north he goes. None of us, I think, would like to wait. Do any of us like to wait? When you're at a red light, do you look over to see when the other light turns yellow? Yeah, I do. And when it finally turns red, you take your foot off the brake to get ready to hit that accelerator. We don't like to wait, do we? We don't like waiting. We need to slow down. Take our time. Don't rush it. And wait on the Lord. Acts 9:31 tells us, "So the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria enjoyed peace, being built up and going on in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit. It continued to increase." Without Saul. But Saul was called, and he was gifted, wasn't he? The secret of the church, both then and now, is not a remarkably gifted individual like Saul. I have heard many times from many preachers, and I've agreed with them, that, boy, wouldn't it be great to find a Saul to send into the Muslim country? Or send a Saul over there, or over here. Can the church survive or grow without a Saul? Yes, it can. Saul would certainly play his important role in the church, but not until he learned, I think, some lessons he needed to learn. And I think that was humble dependence. He learned some humble dependence as he escaped Damascus, dangling from a rope, held by some nameless Christians that we don't know. He learned it when he came to Jerusalem and was rejected by everyone until Barnabas came forward and took a chance with him. He learned it when his life was again threatened, and nameless brothers swept him away to Caesarea, shipped him off to Tarsus, where he had to again wait for the instructions from God. And he did. He waited. And so as we step back from this, I want us to consider some lessons, 3 lessons that we might apply to ourselves. First of all, today's part of Saul's story encourages us to learn to value others. Have each of us learned to really appreciate and embrace the value of other people in our lives? Do we clearly see how other people play a strategic role in our personal survival and our personal success? When I examine myself, I see it. I may be the minister at North Valley. I may hold the office at North Valley, but I am not North Valley. I am not irreplaceable, although I like to think I am. But I can be easily replaced. I remember when the elders sat me down not that long ago to say, "Chris, we're thinking about bringing Theo up here to preach a few times a month. What do you think about that?" I said, "Well, I don't mind at all. I think that would be great." And I remember the look they gave me. They said, "You're okay with that?" I'm like, "Well, yeah." I knew what they were asking. Are you, Chris, we're not trying to replace you. I knew they weren't trying to. But even if they wanted to, they could. You know why? They are the elders. I don't work for them. I don't work for you. I work for God. But they can just choose to say, Chris, we're not giving you a paycheck anymore. And off I'd go. And Theo would be a fantastic minister here for North Valley. Alex would be a wonderful minister for North Valley. Gary would be a wonderful minister for North Valley. Yes, yes. Many of you could. I see a lot of potential. I see the church, gifted, talented people that God has raised up to encourage and strengthen one another. And we're not dependent on any one person. We're dependent upon God. And whenever there is a need that arises, God provides the way. You don't need me or Theo or Alex or Gary. You need the church. You need God. And that's it. And Saul needed to learn that. He was not indispensable. The church could thrive without him. Remember what Mordecai told Queen Esther when he was trying to get her to go in front of the king to speak up? If not you, God will raise up another who will, because he is in control. You know, one of the things we learn in the military is digging foxholes. You ever dig foxholes? Yeah, I know. But you dig it for not yourself, but for at least 2 or 3 people. Because they know that in the heat of battle, if you have to dig up a foxhole, you don't want to be in there alone and by yourself. Try to get somebody else in there with you. God has designed family to be that sort of support network, both the physical family and the spiritual family. And I hope we all see the value of having close relationships. I need people that I can talk to, relay things to give me advice, or just to hear me out. And I get that from a whole source. If you don't have that, you need to have it. If we're going to survive and thrive in the Christian life, we need to be active members of God's family who are engaged in the service and the fellowship of the church. The seniors ministry is, I think, it is fantastic. And the note written on the board that she sent on an email, Bill, that's back there on the board, I read that this morning. Man, I love that. Love it. It's good truth from a faithful, obedient heart from the Lord. I love Bill. I love what he's done with that and everyone that's part of that. Okay, number 2. Today's part of Saul's story also encourages us to learn to humble ourselves. Again, we're not indispensable. We're not irreplaceable. Only God is. So we need to be willing to let God use us as he sees fit. God may employ some of us to be Sauls. Maybe he employs some of us to be Barnabases. Maybe he'll employ some of us to be those unknown individuals who helped Saul over the wall or helped get him out of Jerusalem. As we humble ourselves, we allow God to use us when he wants to and how he wants to. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. And then finally, today's part of Saul's story encourages us to learn to trust God. Does God know what we need? Does he know how to protect and to provide for us? Saul had to learn to trust God and to trust his employment of God's people. As he was going from Arabia back to Damascus, back to Jerusalem, and then whisked away, it was always other people moving him along the way. Those within the body of Christ. Could you imagine helping Saul? Knowing that chances are he killed one of your family members? Put them in prison? And now you're going to help him stay alive? That's the church. And they embraced him. And they loved him. That had to be hard on him. Well, difficult times. When we trust God, we're in good hands. So I want to close out with one last story. It's a story, I read it a while ago. I couldn't find the book. But it's a World War II story about a man who was fighting on a small Pacific island, those tropical islands in the Pacific, and they were getting overrun by the enemy. He got separated from his unit. He could see the enemy, and up there was some cliffs. There was a lot of caves up on this cliff, and so he climbed up there, got inside of one of those caves, and he could see the enemy just all over the place, and they were looking for all of them. And he looked around, and he just knew that they were going to come up to those caves. He saw them, they'll see them, and they were going to find him. It was going to take a few hours, but they were going to find him, and there was nowhere he could go. So he hunkered down, and he prayed to God that, God, please let them not find me. Let me get out of this situation. And as the hours passed by, he busied his mind by watching this spider. It was weaving this little web. It would drop a little bit and swing over, and it would tie off the line. He was thinking, as he was writing about this, thinking about how this spider is going to live. I'm going to die. And when I die, it's just going to keep weaving this web. He could now hear, after a few hours, the enemy coming. They're checking the caves, one at a time. He kept watching the spider, prayed to God, saying, Lord, can you save me? And then he could see them coming. And he knew this was it. When they found him in this cave, he was going to die. He held his breath, got ready for the fight. He could see one of the enemy come out, make his way up toward the cave, and then he stopped, turned around, and he left. He couldn't figure out why. And he realized, he thought, well, maybe it's because of that spider. It had built this web right there at the mouth of the cave. Maybe the guy thought that if someone came into the cave, that web wouldn't be there anymore. And he lived. Providence of God from a little spider. God works in mysterious ways. We can depend on him. We put our trust in him. And we love him. What a blessing we have. We are just Christians. We are in the body of Christ. There's no one greater than anyone else. We're all part of the same church, building one another up in the body of Christ. God is the one we look to. God is the one that we trust. And he is the one that ensures the church will grow. I want us to think on these things this week. You know, we've been studying through the book of Daniel. You know, through all the prophets are always telling the Jews that, you know, this time of captivity will come to an end. But even better is the coming of the Christ. God always takes care of his people. And he will take care of you and me. We must humble ourselves before the Lord, and he will lift us up. This time we're going to have the invitation. It's his invitation to put Christ on in baptism, if you have that need, or if you need the prayers of the congregation. You know, we all have our ups and downs. We want to do the right thing. But arrogance and pride is one of the great pitfalls for mankind, for Christians alike. And God provides the way to help us see that light, to see that those issues, those problems. Perhaps it's through friends or family, or maybe just by reading our Bibles. And he wants us to humble ourselves always. And we need to strive to be like his son, like Paul. So we emulate him, and he emulated Christ. Something to think about as we stand